I never imagined I'd be sitting in a therapist's office, listening to my wife explain, calmly, almost clinically, that she was no longer in love with me. We'd been together since we were 14 years old, married for 15 years, built a life from nothing, 2 kids, a shared history so long and tangled that I honestly thought it made us unbreakable. But that day, during couples therapy, she said something that shattered the ground under me. She told me she didn't see me as her husband anymore. She saw me as her best friend. She explained that her love for me was platonic now, and that this was one of the main reasons she'd refused to be intimate with me for the past 3 years. 3 years. I sat there trying to process the number, realizing how slowly rejection had become my normal. I had convinced myself it was stress, parenting, exhaustion, anything but the truth. Then she added something else. She said she felt resentment toward me. When I asked why, she said she didn't really know. Maybe it was because I spent more time with the kids than with her. Maybe it was because she felt emotionally disconnected. She admitted that, because of this resentment, she had even started thinking about other men. That part hit me harder than I expected. I had absolutely no idea how to respond. I'd been trying, really trying, to be present as a father, a provider, a supportive partner. And now I was being told that the very things I thought made me a good husband might be the reason she pulled away. Later that same day, as if the universe wanted to twist the knife, she came home drunk. She was emotional, unsteady, and suddenly desperate for intimacy. I said no at first. I was confused, hurt, and honestly scared of what it would mean. But she kept pushing, crying, begging until I finally gave in. The next morning, she woke up cold and distant. She told me she felt disgusted with herself. She repeated the same words she'd said in therapy. I was her best friend. She had a rule about never sleeping with friends. And crossing that line made her feel sick. Hearing that after being intimate with my own wife did something to me that I still struggle to put into words. Later that day we talked again. Another long, painful conversation. She told me all she really wanted from me now was companionship. Co-parenting, roommate-style relationship. Stability for the kids. Nothing more. I asked her the question that had been eating me alive. What is it about me that makes me so unattractive to you? She stared at the floor and said, I don't know. She said she did love me, but not in the same way. That she'd felt disconnected for years. That marriage felt like too much work. That her entire focus was on the children now. She told me my contributions as a co-parent meant a lot to her. Just not my role as a husband. I was stunned, angry, broken, and completely lost. A few days later, the word resentment kept echoing in my head. It felt poisonous, especially because she couldn't explain where it came from. I brought it up again in therapy. This time, our therapist started asking deeper questions, mostly directed at my wife. We talked about our past, about how we'd been together since we were teenagers, how we had kids at 19, how we spent years in poverty, scraping by, sacrificing everything. No social life, no freedom, just survival mode and diapers and bills. Our kids are 12 and 14 now. As the therapist asked question after question, I noticed something unsettling. Almost every answer my wife gave revolved around the kids. Her tone shifted whenever the conversation drifted toward her personal regrets, as if she was afraid to admit anything that might sound like she regretted motherhood. I finally said it out loud. Do you think you're afraid to say yes? Because it might make you feel guilty? The room went quiet. That moment cracked something open, but it also made me realize something terrifying. If the kids were at the center of all her frustration, where did that leave us? And more importantly, where did that leave me? What happened next in therapy uncovered a truth neither of us was ready to face, and it would force me to make the hardest decision of my life. The silence after that therapy session felt heavier than anything we'd said out loud. It was like we had brushed up against a truth neither of us wanted to fully acknowledge. The therapist gently encouraged my wife to look at her feelings outside the lens of motherhood, to see herself not just as a mom, but as an individual woman with her own unmet needs. That's when something finally shifted. For the first time, my wife admitted she was deeply frustrated. Not with me specifically, but with life itself. She talked about how much we had missed out on. Not dating. Not partying. Not other partners. But friendships. Freedom. A sense of identity outside of survival and parenting. She said something that stuck with me. I didn't miss out on experiences, she said. I missed out on people. That hit hard. For over a decade, our lives had revolved around work, kids, and keeping our heads above water. We had become isolated without even realizing it. No close friends. No shared community. No space to just exist as adults. And yet, every time I encouraged her to invest in friendships or time for herself over the years, she resisted. The reason was always the same. Kids. 90% of her explanations, frustrations, and emotional roadblocks traced back to them in some way. I started to notice a pattern that made me deeply uncomfortable. So I asked the question I had been afraid to say out loud. Do you think you're upset with me because I'm part of why we had kids so young? A pause. Then she admitted something shocking. She said yes, on some level she was upset at me for that. Not logically. Not fairly. But emotionally. She quickly followed it up by saying she knew it wasn't reasonable, that it took two people, that she wasn't blaming me outright. Still, hearing it spoken aloud felt like progress. Painful progress, but progress nonetheless. For the first time, resentment had a shape. Direction. Something tangible we could actually work on. By the end of the session, we agreed to start small. We would both invest more time in friendships, together and individually. We would encourage each other to build lives outside the walls of our home. It sounded hopeful, but underneath it all, the big question still loomed. What did this mean for us? When the therapist asked what actionable steps we would take moving forward, everything suddenly felt vague again. Abstract. I couldn't sit with that uncertainty anymore. So I asked her directly, "What is your plan for us?" Her answer cut deep. She said she still had no desire to be intimate with me. That she loved me immensely. That she felt terrible for not being there for me in the ways I needed. But nothing had changed. I brought up everything I could think of. Past events, unresolved issues, even the brief attempt at swinging we'd tried long ago as a mechanical solution. She repeated once again that it wasn't the problem. I agreed. We had tried it. It didn't fix anything. We moved on. And yet, we still couldn't identify the true root of her resentment. That's when I realized something devastating. There was nothing left for me to fix. I told her, calmly but firmly, that I could not accept this dynamic. That I had done everything I could. That this wasn't about me failing anymore. It was about her not wanting to participate in the marriage as a full partner. I told her I wasn't willing to be a convenience roommate. A co-parent with no intimacy. I said I loved her deeply and wanted this to work, but only if the effort was mutual. Then I said the words I never thought I'd say. If this continues, divorce will be the only outcome. There were tears. A lot of them. The session ended bleak and unresolved. She said nothing. I walked out feeling hollow, but also strangely determined. Because for the first time I understood something clearly. If nothing changed, I was already losing myself. What I did next shocked my wife completely, and it marked the beginning of a transformation neither of us saw coming. I didn't walk out of that therapy session with a dramatic plan or a sense of victory. What I felt instead was quiet resolve. I knew something had to change, and if my wife wasn't willing to work on the marriage, then I needed to stop working myself into emotional exhaustion. That's when I committed to what people call the 180 approach. It sounded simple on paper and brutal in reality. The idea was to stop chasing, stop overgiving, stop trying to earn affection from someone who had already emotionally checked out. Instead, I would focus on myself, protect my emotions, and accept the dynamic my wife said she wanted, without complaining, bargaining, or pleading. The same day, I told her plainly that things were going to be different. I said I would respect the roommate, co-parent dynamic she asked for. I made it clear I wasn't happy about it and would never be okay with it, but I was done trying to fix something she didn't want to fix. She nodded, said she understood, and went to bed. That night, something in me shifted. I started creating distance, not out of spite but out of self-preservation. Kept conversations short, neutral, transactional. I focused on my routines, my responsibilities, and my own mental space. The first real test came faster than I expected. She asked me for help with a personal issue, something I normally would have jumped in to handle without hesitation. This time I calmly said no. The look on her face said everything. She was shocked, upset. She accused me of being petty, of acting childish. I explained as calmly as I could that she was now fully in charge of her own life, just as I was in charge of mine. If we were friends and roommates, then boundaries mattered. That conversation didn't end well. We barely spoke for the rest of the day. And when we did, it was only about logistics, the kids, the house, schedules. Nothing more. Kept the distance going. A few days in, I could see it wearing on her. She was visibly stressed and unsettled. Normally, this is where I would step in, offer help, reassurance, comfort. But this time I didn't. One night she broke down crying. She told me she felt overwhelmed and stressed, and that something felt off about me. She said my indifference scared her. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. Then I told her the truth. This is the dynamic you asked for. I'm just taking care of myself now, just like you are. That was one of the hardest moments of my life. Every instinct in me wanted to hold her, to comfort her, to make it better. But I also knew something else. For years, emotional closeness had been used, consciously or not, to keep me in the friend zone while my needs were ignored. And I couldn't allow that anymore. I stayed the course. A few days later, I sent her a message outlining our shared expenses and proposed we split everything 50-50ths moving forward. Bills, responsibilities, all of it. She completely lost it. She said it came out of nowhere, that it felt cold and extreme. I responded calmly. Friends split things evenly. As your friend, I expect nothing less. That moment was eye-opening for me. For the first time, I saw how much of her comfort and stability had been quietly built on my emotional and financial overextension. How much had been taken for granted. Still, I didn't back down. I told her this was the dynamic she wanted, and frankly, it was still a better deal than being on her own. As difficult as it was, something unexpected began to happen. She started paying attention. What happened next revealed just how deeply I'd been taken for granted, and why my silence suddenly mattered more than all my words ever had. By the end of the first week, the emotional atmosphere in our house had completely changed. Not louder, not explosive, just different. Quiet in a way that demanded attention. I stayed consistent with the 180 approach, even though every part of it felt unnatural to me. I've always been someone who fixes things, smooths conflict, and puts others' comfort before my own. Now I was doing the opposite, and it felt like I was betraying my own instincts. But the results were impossible to ignore. My wife was no longer relaxed. She wasn't comfortable. The ease she once had, knowing I would always step in, always help, always soften the edges, was gone. And without that safety net, she seemed unsettled in ways I hadn't seen before. She started finding reasons to talk to me. Small things at first. Random comments. Questions that didn't really need answers. I responded politely, briefly, and without emotional weight. No cold sarcasm. No anger. Just neutrality. That neutrality seemed to bother her more than anger ever had. I also noticed something else. She started taking more time for herself. She went out alone, reconnected with people, spent less time buried in parenting duties and more time acting like an individual again. For years I had encouraged this. Now, without me pushing or rescuing, she was finally doing it on her own. As strange as it sounds, I was proud of her. At the same time, I was grieving the realization that so much of our relationship had been built on my overfunctioning. On me carrying emotional weight so she didn't have to. On me sacrificing intimacy and connection just to keep the peace. There were moments when I almost broke. Nights when she looked exhausted or overwhelmed, and every instinct told me to step in, to fix it, to remind her I was still there. But I held back, not because I didn't care, but because caring without boundaries had nearly destroyed me. She began asking questions. Why are you so distant? Why don't you react anymore? Why does it feel like you're already gone? Each time I gave her the same calm answer. I'm still here. I'm just taking care of myself. The truth was, I was deeply sad. This wasn't a power play or a punishment. It was survival. And the realizations that came with it weren't pleasant. I started to see how transactional our relationship had already been, long before I ever changed my behavior. How often my value had been tied to what I provided rather than who I was. How intimacy had become conditional, while my effort remained expected. Despite the sadness, something else was happening. She was changing. She became more emotionally present, more curious, more aware of my absence in ways she had never been before. I could see her wrestling with the reality that I was no longer filling every emotional gap automatically. We were still cordial, still respectful, still functioning as parents, but the illusion of comfort was gone. And for the first time in years, the balance had shifted. I didn't know where this would lead. Reconciliation, divorce, something in between. All I knew was this. No matter how it ended, I was finally standing up for myself. And strangely enough, that seemed to matter. Then, after weeks of silence and distance, my wife did something I never expected, and it changed the direction of everything. Almost 9 weeks into keeping my distance, something happened that stopped me in my tracks. It was Memorial Day weekend when my wife approached me and asked if I wanted to go out for coffee. Not casually, not in passing. She told me she needed to talk, really talk about something important. That alone felt monumental. I honestly couldn't remember the last time she had initiated a serious conversation with me. My mind immediately started racing. Was this the end? Was she about to ask for a separation? Or worse, confirm that nothing would ever change? Despite the knot in my stomach, I agreed. We found a quiet coffee shop away from the kids. As soon as we sat down, she began opening up in ways I hadn't seen in years. She talked about her emotional state, her mental health, her fears, and how lost she had been feeling, not just in our marriage but in herself. For the first time, she wasn't defensive. She wasn't deflecting. She took responsibility. She acknowledged how absent she had been and admitted that much of what she was struggling with had little to do with me. Hearing that was both validating and heartbreaking. I had spent years internalizing rejection, assuming I was the problem, when in reality she had been fighting her own battles silently. Then she said something that caught me completely off guard. She asked me for help. Not as a roommate, not as a co-parent, but as her husband. That moment alone made every painful week of distance worth it. When she finished sharing, I told her I wanted to be honest about where I was. I acknowledged her feelings and made it clear that they were valid. I told her my goal had always been reconciliation, that I still believed in the life we promised each other, and that my love for her hadn't faded. Then I told her how this situation had been affecting me. I explained that my distance wasn't meant to punish her. It was self-protection. Years of rejection and emotional neglect had taken a toll, and I had to safeguard my mental health. I told her I couldn't control her feelings or choices, but I could control how I responded to them. That led naturally into what I'd been working on during the 180. I explained that I had spent years trying to make her happy, anticipating her needs, doing what I thought she wanted, only to feel dismissed and unwanted. That cycle had to end. I needed to grow for myself, not as a reaction to her approval or rejection. I told her about the new habits I was building, about focusing on my health, my routines, my confidence. And I made it clear that none of this meant abandoning my responsibilities as a father or partner. It meant becoming a stronger, more grounded version of myself. She listened, really listened. Then she told me she noticed. She said she could see the changes, that she felt left behind, not because I was doing something wrong, but because she hadn't been doing the work on herself. She admitted that many of her struggles were the result of choices she had made, not things I had done to her. By the time we finished talking, nearly 3 hours had passed. The energy between us was different. Hopeful, cautious but real. I told her I still wanted this marriage, but I would not live under the same conditions as before. Something had to fundamentally change. And this time she agreed. What we decided next came with a deadline, and a truth that would determine whether our marriage survived or ended for good. As the coffee cups emptied and the conversation slowed, I knew this wasn't just another emotional moment that would fade with time. If we were going to move forward, we needed clarity, real structure, not vague promises or temporary effort. So I shared the framework I'd been thinking about for weeks. I started by saying something that felt counterintuitive but necessary. We were no longer responsible for each other's happiness. Not in the way we had been before. She wasn't responsible for fixing me, and I wasn't responsible for fixing her. We were each responsible for ourselves. That meant our growth, healing, and emotional well-being had to be self-driven. We could invite each other into that process, support each other when asked, and walk alongside one another. But we could no longer expect our partner to fill internal voids we hadn't addressed ourselves. Surprisingly, she agreed. We talked about accountability, about how resentment thrives in silence and unspoken expectations. From now on, if something mattered, it had to be communicated. If it wasn't communicated, it couldn't be used later as ammunition. No more mind reading. No more assumptions. Then we did something we had never done before. We agreed to create clear lists of needs and wants. Not demands. Not ultimatums. Just clarity. These lists wouldn't be used to argue or keep score. They would exist as tools, to understand, to grow, and to choose. Choice was the key word. Anything we did for each other moving forward would be done because we wanted to, not because we felt obligated, pressured, or afraid of consequences. We both agreed that resentment often grows when effort is forced instead of freely given. Then came the hardest part. We set a deadline. Memorial Day 2025. By that date, we would independently evaluate our lives and our marriage. Not together. Individually. We would each ask ourselves one simple question. Am I genuinely happy here? If the answer was no, we agreed we would move toward divorce, without blame, without rewriting history, and without pretending we hadn't tried. Each of us would take full responsibility for the choices we made along the way. If needs weren't met, the question wouldn't be, why didn't you? It would be, did I do everything I could to communicate and address this? If the answer was yes, then we could walk away knowing we left nothing unresolved. That level of accountability was terrifying but also freeing. We also agreed that real change had to be internally motivated. Not short-term fixes. Not emotional band-aids. Long-term habits built because we cared. Not because we were afraid of losing each other. By the end of the conversation, there were tears. Real ones. The kind that come with relief, not desperation. There was hugging. A sense of teamwork that had been missing for years. Nothing was guaranteed. We both knew that. But this was different. In the weeks that followed, the changes became visible. She committed fully to therapy and mental health. She started medication that helped stabilize her mood. She became more confident, more present, and more emotionally available. And slowly, cautiously, we began rebuilding intimacy. Not just physically, but emotionally. Simple touches. Words of affirmation. Moments of connection that felt intentional rather than forced. I know this isn't a fairy tale ending. There's still uncertainty. Still work ahead. Still the very real possibility that this ends in divorce. But for the first time in a long time, I feel at peace. I know my boundaries. I know my worth. And no matter how this story ends, I can honestly say I showed up. For myself, for my family, and for the marriage we once believed in. Sometimes loving someone means being willing to lose them, so you don't lose yourself.